Welcome, Gunrunner.
Since I started running polls for these amazing facts videos, we've seen some pretty close results that went right up until the wire. But I don't think there was ever a closer one than this. The Sega SG-1000 was the eventual winner, but there was just 2% in it, with the Amstrad GX4000 and Fairchild Channel F drawing for second place. In many ways I was pleased to see the Sega console win, because this was actually the third time it had featured on one of these polls, and the previous two times it finished in second place. It's the third time lucky, I guess. I certainly wasn't surprised to see the flood of votes for Sega's first console once again, because despite being a product of one of gaming's most famous companies, it remains pretty obscure and a lesser known system. I think a great deal of this is because the console never got a full worldwide release, and completely missed many of the biggest markets for such a product, including the UK, Germany, and most importantly, the whole of North America. In this video, I really hope to raise the profile of the criminally ignored Sega SG-1000, telling you why it was so influential for the company, how it laid the groundwork for all the success that came after, and why you should be taking another look at what it has to offer. So let's get on with the show as I present 10 amazing Sega SG-1000 facts.
Sega ビデオゲーム SG-1000
トンネルだスリップゾーンだおおスリルとスピードゲームセンターの興奮そのまま
セガモナコグランプリ
お父さんには麻雀もありますアメリカ横断弾丸で目指せニューヨークぶっ飛ばして順位を上げろゲームセンターの興奮そのまま
セガ GP レース
お父さんにはチャンピオンゴルフ
Many people may think that the Sega SG-1000 was designed to cash in on the success of Western game consoles like the Atari 2600 and Mattel Intellivision, or simply as a rival to the Nintendo Famicom. But the actual real story behind its origins are a bit more interesting than that. Development of the console started in 1982 after Sega started to see a dramatic downturn in their arcade revenues and wanted to explore extra revenue streams. This decline was so bad, in fact, that Sega's then owners, Gulf and Western, sold the North American arcade division to rivals Bally Midway. They had watched Atari make a similar transition with great success, utilising the power of their arcade origins to help push their home console. As the leading arcade game manufacturer in Japan, Sega were best placed to follow suit in their homeland. In fact, Sega were very forward thinking in their vision for the console, creating a semi-compatible arcade board at the same time, hoping they could release the same games in the arcade and the home, much like we saw some 8 years later with the SNK Neo Geo. Unfortunately, arcade technology was progressing at such a rapid rate that by the time the first 3 games arrived in the form of Champion Boxing, Champion Pro Wrestling and Doki Doki Penguin Land, the hardware seemed horribly out of date and it was quietly discontinued. Word has it that although Sega were already planning to release a console of their own, the revelation that Nintendo were doing the same caused them to make a number of adjustments to that initial plan. Firstly, there was the discussion over what the Sega game would actually be, as some within Sega were pushing towards the idea of a games-capable home computer instead of a console. The company would ultimately decide to do both. Secondly, they sped up development in order to get their console out at the same time as the Famicom. It was released on the same day, in fact, the 15th of July 1983. This accelerated R&D led to some pretty crucial design decisions, as Sega ultimately decided to base the console on existing hardware and off-the-shelf parts, rather than engineering their own unique chipset, as most people expected they'd do. Both the SG-1000 console and SC-3000 computer would ultimately be based around an early version of what became the MSX standard, with a Z80 CPU, Texas Instruments graphics chip and a TI sound chip too. the Famicom definitely got off to a stronger start, mainly thanks to its much better launch lineup that included big name titles like Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr. and Popeye, with games like Mario Brothers and Mahjong being released by the year's end. Sega meanwhile offered up a range of much less recognisable arcade titles, including the likes of N-Sub, Congo Bongo, Yamato and Starjacker. However, going into 1984, Nintendo were having a lot of issues building on their early success, with new games still on the ground and many Famicom consoles being recalled due to a faulty circuit. Sega managed to capitalise on this success, having delivered 3 times the amount of games by the end of 1983 and continuing this support well into 1984. This meant that by the end of 1983, the SG-1000 had chalked up sales of over 160,000 units, far exceeding Sega's 50,000 estimate. Unfortunately, that success didn't last, as Nintendo started to make some clever decisions that would ultimately give them the edge, and prove to be the basis of their fortunes going forward, but more on that later in the video. As I already mentioned, the Sega SG-1000 hardware is based on a common chipset that eventually became known as the MSX standard. This hardware design came about after the ASCII Corporation, Microsoft and Spectra Video joined forces to come up with a universal personal computer format that could then be licensed out to electronics companies around the world. The huge take-up of the MSX standard meant that the hardware found in Sega's first console was almost identical to a plethora of other consoles and home computers of the era, with the only real differences being found in the BIOS, although the final MSX design did feature a slightly different sound chip. Other home consoles with the same basic chipset include the Deus MX, Casio PV-1000 and most famously of all, the ColecoVision. This means that it's very easy to port SG-1000 games to the ColecoVision and MSX. In the case of the latter, there were numerous Sega games released for the computer that were near identical to the originals, such as Wonder Boy, Zaxxon, Bank Panic, Ninja Princess and Doki Doki Penguin Land. In more recent years, we've seen various homebrewers take on the task of porting SG-1000 games over to both the ColecoVision and MSX for more people to enjoy. Despite being designed and manufactured by a huge company like Sega, the SG-1000 remains a pretty obscure console within the retro gaming world, but even less people seem to be aware of the SG-1000 sibling, a fully compatible computer called the SC-3000. Whereas the SG before the 1000 stands for Sega Game, the SC stands for Sega Computer, and it was released on the exact same day, as mentioned earlier in my video. The SC-3000 was designed as a reasonably priced entry point into home computing, which is no doubt evident by the ZX Spectrum style rubberized chiclet keyboard. It was designed with both business and gaming in mind, but obviously more suited to the latter with Sega's arcade pedigree. That said, Sega did release a later revision of the computer called the SC-3000H, with a more professional full travel keyboard, hoping to persuade more people that it was indeed a proper computer. As well as being able to use all SG-1000 cartridges and cassette tapes, Sega also released a special add-on which enabled the computer to use floppy disks too. The Super Control Station SF-7000 was released in 1984 for an asking price of 79,800 yen. It would allow the user to run software off 3-inch floppy disks, as well as adding a further 64K of RAM, 8K of ROM, a Centronics parallel port, and an RS-232 serial port. But the high price of the unit meant that it was never very successful, and these are now extremely rare and hard to find. Earlier on in this video, I spoke about how Nintendo pulled a pretty huge manoeuvre to take the Japanese console market back from Sega and hold on to it, and now it's time to talk about this historically important turn of events in more detail. As mentioned, the lack of games for the Famicom was proving a real sticking point for Nintendo and was costing them dearly. Although they had been a pretty successful arcade game manufacturer, they had a far smaller back catalogue than Sega and didn't have the same roster of games designers and programmers to call on either. So they had a good look around and saw not only a host of other coin-op companies keen to sell their wares, but also lots of new software houses who had sprung up to make games for Japanese home computers like the MSX and NEC PC-88. While Sega were keen to keep their new console to themselves and take all the glory, Nintendo started sending development kits to these other companies to encourage them to create new Famicom games, and before long the titles were flowing. The Big N tied many of these to strict exclusivity contracts, barring them for developing for Sega's console too, a tactic they very much refined and employed aggressively as they took over the North American console market too. In 1984, Sega Enterprises became an independent company once again after a management buyout from Sega Japan president Hayao Nakayama and co-founder David Rosen, with support from CSK Corporation. The first action of the newly reorganised company was to release a redesigned version of the SG-1000 that would be known as the Mark II. The Mark II not only featured a sleek new design, but also new joypad controllers instead of the original joysticks, which drew even more comparisons to the rival Nintendo Famicom. The arrival of the new console also saw the introduction of a new software format too, as the Sega MyCard was unveiled. Sega's then head of consumer hardware development, Hideki Sato, stated that he disliked the design of the original cartridges, saying they looked like small black tombstones when inserted in the console, which is why he developed the new format. He even stated in a more recent interview that his proudest achievement of the SG-1000 era was creating cheerier, pocket-sized MyCards. Aside from the card catcher cartridge, which was needed to play this new range of lower cost and cheaper to produce games, another essential add-on that came about thanks to the arrival of the Mark II was the SK-1100 keyboard. This made it possible to turn your SG-1000 into a fully fledged SC-3000 computer, opening up even more software for your enjoyment. Of course, the new naming convention stuck, as the backwards compatible replacement for the SG-1000 was the Sega Mark III, which would of course be redesigned as the Master System for the West. Interestingly, the original code name for the Mega Drive was in fact the Sega Mark IV. In 1986, 2 years after Sega had officially discontinued the SG-1000, a Taiwanese company called Bit Corporation, who at the time were best known for their range of bootleg Atari 2600 games, created a clone of the console called the DINA 2-in-1. Originally created as an illegal copy of the ColecoVision for Asian markets, it was also able to play games from the Sega SG-1000 due to the huge similarities in the hardware, hence the 2-in-1 part of the name. Due to both consoles being based on that same technology, Bitcorp were able to include 2 cartridge slots and a BIOS that would change depending on what slot was being used. As well as being able to play games for both the SG-1000 and ColecoVision, Bitcorp would also develop their own games for use with the DINA 2-in-1, such as Strike It, Meteoric Shower, Tank Wars and Cosmic Crisis. Many of these would also be released as ColecoVision branded cartridges. But DINA never specifically supported the SG-1000 side of things, sadly. Over in the West, mail order game specialists, Telegames saw a great opportunity to get in on the act. They had previously been an official distributor for the ColecoVision in Europe and North America, and once Coleco stopped production of the console, they wanted to continue selling the system and its games to their large base of loyal customers. So they acquired the rights from Coleco to officially distribute the DINA 2-in-1 as the Telegames Personal Arcade, promoting it as a ColecoVision compatible console. They also rebranded and re-released Bitcorp's range of ColecoVision games under the Telegames moniker too. Perhaps rather strangely though, they made little to no mention of the SG-1000 compatibility in their advertising or even on the box for the console, and indeed, Telegames didn't even offer SG-1000 games as part of their otherwise exhaustive product range. But they did make sure the SG-1000 mode was left intact, and it was still possible to utilise this compatibility option on their own version of the console. I'm guessing a large part of this was the lack of official licensing from Sega, and them wanting to avoid any potential legal action. The DINA wasn't the only clone of the SG-1000 either, as there was also the Othello Multivision from Tsukuda Original. This one was officially licensed however, although it was marketed as an original system with its own small library of games. SG-1000 compatibility was mentioned on the back of them. But the built-in controls and high price gave potential customers no reason to buy it over the real deal. The built-in Othello game, hence the name of the console, was hardly a big draw either. Although Sega themselves only ever released the SG-1000 in Japan, officially licensed and rebranded versions of the console were released in several other markets around the world. The most notable of these was Australasia, with widespread distribution across both Australia and New Zealand, where it very much helped put Sega on the map to dominate the region in successive console generations. Released shortly after the original Japanese version, the Australian PAL version of the SG-1000 was sold through leading retail chain John Sands Electronics. Over New Zealand it was handled slightly differently, as Grandstand Leisure took hold of the rights, distributing it out to various retailers rather than selling it themselves. The British-owned company had previous experience in this market too, having sold official versions of both the Fairchild Channel F and the 1292 Advanced Programmable System in PAL markets. The console saw a limited release in Italy and Spain as well as Taiwan, where the console enjoyed a brief period of popularity under the Aeronix brand, before the market was flooded with much cheaper Famiclones. If somebody asked you to name a legendary Sega games designer, I'm pretty sure that the first name in your lips would be Yuji Naka. After all, this was the man behind such highly acclaimed titles as Sonic the Hedgehog, Knights, Phantasy Star, Burning Rangers and Choo Choo Rocket. But where did Yuji Naka get his start in video games? On the SG-1000 of course, hence why I'm featuring him here. Yuji's very first game was the excellent Girls Garden for Sega's first system, which is notable in a number of different regards. Firstly, for being one of the very first home console games to feature a female protagonist. Secondly, for being one of the SG-1000's few exclusives. And lastly, for its highly original gameplay design that follows a girl as she gathers flowers to try and win the love of a local boy. Sadly, Naka never developed any further games for the SG-1000 as he moved on to helping to develop its successor, the Sega Master System, where he created Fist of North Star, renamed as Black Belt in the West, as well as the original Phantasy Star game, and was also responsible for the SMS ports of both Space Harrier and Spy vs Spy. Although many people regard the SG-1000 as a failure for Sega, it was actually reasonably successful for the company, with sales of around 2 million units worldwide, and it very much opened up the home console market for Sega to develop their ideas further and experience even more success with the Master System and then the Mega Drive after it. Sega's head of consumer hardware development during the SG-1000 era, Hideki Sato, has since reflected positively on the innovations he made during the development of the SG-1000, but admitted that the console had limitations because of how the market was at the time. He stated that Sega was too inexperienced to develop a video game console at that time, being quoted as saying, "The problem was, while we knew how to make arcade games, we didn't really know anything about home console development. In fact, the very idea of a consumer market for video games was unheard of in Japan back then. It was just another new business idea." It's a bit of a shame that the SG-1000 is seen in the way it is today, as a failure rather than a defining moment for Sega. I'd love to see Sega release a Master System Mini and include a selection of SG-1000 games on it to help embrace the console's important legacy.
と楽しめるビデオゲーム SG-1000 に専用キーボード SK-1100 が新発売か手つなげばパソコンベーシックから学習ソフトまでとにかく楽しく
And that completes my list of 10 amazing Sega SG-1000 facts. Which of these fabulous facts was your favourite, or can you think of any other tantalising tidbits of trivia that I didn't include? As always, I love to hear your thoughts and views in the comments, so please get typing. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons and YouTube members for continuing to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following patrons in particular for their much appreciated pledges: Grady Haynes, D Vaughan, Mitchell Valentino, Neptune, Seth A. Robinson, Carl Olsen, Dos Gamerman, Sonic Mania 999, Paul Daniel, Andrew McKay, Retro Resolution, Matt Standish, James Taylor, Aussie B, 8-Bit Guy, and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support all my creative endeavours, including this YouTube channel, then please go and check out my Patreon right now. You can get access to host extra content including downloads, exclusive videos, creative insights and much more besides. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.